You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Daly and Kevin Laramie.
Hello and welcome to episode number 10 of Scuderia F1, the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One racing. My name is Mark Daly. I'm your host, and as always, I'm joined by Kevin Laramie. Kevin, have you calmed down and gotten back to normal after that extremely exciting week in Montreal?
You have no idea the week I had, Mark, in Montreal, the Canadian Grand Prix, brushing shoulders with people I usually watch on TV. Again, Mr. David Croft, what a class act, and the best voice in the business, I have to say. One of the best describer, commentator, play-by-play. I don't like to say play-by-play for F1 because it's not play-by-play, wheel-by-wheel maybe. But wow, and what an amazing first couple of turn. What a start. What a Grand Prix. What a race. What a weekend. Weather wasn't there, especially not for the fans. It was cold, but it does make for an interesting and intriguing type of race.
Definitely. And those first couple of corners, like you say, were very, very interesting, especially with that start. Mercedes didn't get it right. And we saw Sebastian Vettel in the scarlet red Ferrari shoot up from third to first and disappear a little bit from the two Mercedes, who had a bit of a coming together in the first corner, with Nico Rosberg coming out quite poorly on the end of that little coming together with his teammate Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah. And, if you just look at it once, I've actually watched about 15 times in the last hour. But during the race itself, when you just saw it happen live, you're like, oh, well, it's Hamilton's fault. He just pushed Rosberg out and he wanted to take the whole space he needed to try not to get run in by Vettel. But when you watch it closely, Hamilton started so bad. Same for Rosberg, but Hamilton started so bad that the 8 meters between the two cars is closed like this by Vettel, and Vettel's off to the inside, and he's in front. Hamilton has to react, has to give space to Vettel, so it moves a little bit to his right. Moving so, Rosberg had already committed by doing the outside of Hamilton for his second Grand Prix in a row. Actually, not in Monaco, but the one before. Like, hey, I had success in the outside, I'll just go do that. But being on the outside, he was stuck there when Vettel made his move, and Hamilton had nowhere to go, had to do it, and it was at the end of turn 1, just going into turn 2, the more looping of the two, but it's that kind of a chicane type of turn. There was no other place for Rosberg to go, and if you look at it carefully, he takes the decision to go because there's asphalt there, and he can just go on the asphalt. Then he does touch the grass a little bit when he's coming back on the track after the turn, but he still was on asphalt. He had the choice, and he didn't want to force it. He could have forced it and even stay on track, maybe putting one wheel on the grass, but he chose to go on the asphalt to save his car for later on. So really, it was not necessarily nobody's fault, but Vettel's move was so unexpected that Hamilton's reaction had to give something. He took the space literally out of the wheels. He cut underneath the feet of Rosberg, literally underneath the pedal.
Well, I think that's a great thing about that series of a couple of corners when you get to the end of the straightaway there, that you can be on the racing line and think that you have the right to go in the corner, and then all of a sudden, as things change, as you move through those corners, you are the one that maybe isn't on the racing line. And I think exactly like you say, that Rosberg trying to go around the corner, tried to maybe sneak a little bit around Hamilton, and he was a little bit ahead of him at one point, but as they started to go through the corner, then Lewis was a little bit further ahead of him, and they did touch slightly. And I think although Rosberg would have been upset and would have been angry to bump wheels with his teammate, he did make the right decision just to pull out of there and go across on the asphalt. But when he did come back onto the grass, or onto the asphalt on the other side, he was quite slow. I think he must have lost what grip he had in the tires, just going through that dirty bit of asphalt and maybe getting a little bit on the grass, because when he came back on, he was just being passed gassed left, right, and center. Where did he come back out? Was it 10th, 12th, something like that?
He came back out before the Red Bulls. The Red Bulls took over him when he came back. So he came back third. But the Red Bulls then took over him. And then the William and all the other cars right then. But it's after turn 2. Well, the long looping. So after the grass where he came out, touched a little bit of grass. But you mentioned the grip on the tires. He didn't lose it because nobody had it. Nobody had it after turn 1 and 2. And that's another factor on Vettel's move and the reaction of Rosberg and Hamilton. You maybe react a little bit more because you don't have the same grip. You don't have the same confidence. It's not the same feel. Hey, you have to remember, the tire are what's touching the ground, are what giving the pilot vibration. If the tires themselves don't have the grip or not up to temperature, the whole feeling of the driver is different. So that's another point to consider, that in these 3 cars, in that instant of return, a lot of things was going on in everybody's mind. And it's almost a miracle that nobody really crashed into each other. And it is a testament of how skilled those 3 drivers are.
Definitely. And we've seen plenty of incidents in that corner over the years in Montreal. So
usually it's yearly. You always see one, usually. Always.
Oh, exactly. So that's why it was a bit of a miracle that everybody got through there unscathed. And there was relatively few retirements throughout the entire race, which was interesting to see. But it was an interesting opening lap, and it was an interesting several laps to get the race going. And just when it seemed like things were really settling down, Jenson Button and his McLaren came to a somewhat unceremonious end on that long straightaway at the back there, going up in flames, pulling off to the side, and then activating the virtual safety car, which led to one of the interesting moments. Well, I guess it was already the interesting moment on the opening corner. But
pitting under a virtual safety car because he thought it was going to be there for another lap, but it wasn't. Just go back to Jenson Button for a second, Mark.
Yep.
His engine exploded. And we talked about 2 things in the preview show. Engine might explode and brakes are going to suffer. We saw both happen in this weekend. And it wasn't with the leaders, but if you read between the line, Hamilton and Rosberg car are not perfect. They're not necessarily perfect. Look at Hamilton's reaction when he wins the race. He crouches down and looks underneath his car. He looked at the front. He looked at the suspension. Looked at everything. Because he didn't like what he was driving. There's some sort in this race and that day that he didn't like the feel, didn't like all that. And he needed to take a look after he just won the race. That tells you a lot. If it's not that important and you're not worried about it, you're not going to look after just winning a race. You're going to get that champagne. You're going to talk to Danica Dial, Mayor of Montreal, and go party on. And eventually with your engineer is going to say, hey, guys, I saw this earlier. I felt this earlier today, and maybe we should take a look. You don't do it yourself right away in front of everybody. So that tells you a lot about how Hamilton was feeling and how happy he was. He would have been that happy if he knew that he was dominating that easily. He truly had to work for that win.
Oh, he definitely did. And considering how pacey that Ferrari was in the opening part of the lap, or the opening part of the race, and I think that was a real turning point because they obviously thought that virtual safety car was going to be out longer than it was because Vettel came into the pits. I don't even think he'd reached his pit box by the time that the yellow lights went out and the virtual safety car was switched off. And no sooner had he driven off than his teammate Kimi Räikkönen came in for a pit stop as well. So that was bad timing by Ferrari. And it was interesting because Hamilton was ahead, but Vettel was always pulling him back in, and he was pulling him back in not by maybe a tenth of a second or a couple hundredths of a second here or there. At some points, he was pulling him in a second a lap or a second and a half a lap. Yeah. And then I think the closest he got at the later part of the race was about 4.5 seconds. Mm-hmm. And that was about as close as he got, because the other interesting thing I thought was just the tire compounds. Yeah. Those ultra soft tires didn't last very long, and everybody, it seemed, came in within the first 10 to 12 laps to change from the ultra softs to a pair of super softs or a pair of soft tires, and those definitely seemed to go and last a lot longer. But those ultra softs really went away really, really quickly.
But the thing is, everybody's got its own data on tires, and it's not necessarily shared with different teams. So they do have different data that we don't know about those tires. For every team, every car deteriorates those tires differently as well. Hamilton, after 2 laps, you started to see ridges. You didn't with Vettel after 4, but on the 5th, you see them appear like it was Quebec roads. So there's very quickly situation changed for those tires. So if you look at it that way, how Vettel. So imagine you're Ferrari's strategist. First of all, you don't want to be Ferrari's strategist, especially not now, having the type of season, strategically speaking, that Ferrari is having. You don't want to be that guy because you're going to get fired soon.
But high pressure job for sure.
Exactly. Especially if your last name is not Italian, you kind of have to be named finished by O, A, or I to be able to be successful at this position in Ferrari. But if you go back to what I was talking about, the tires, the duration, and the data that a team like Ferrari would have compared to other teams with their own car, maybe that's why they changed it, because their own ultra soft were deteriorating maybe more than they would expect. And they thought that, well, if ours are doing this, maybe everybody else is going to do this. We can undercut them right now by pitting. We have an opportunity with the virtual safety car now. Do you pull the trigger or not? Not knowing those data, it's hard for us to judge if you should do it or not. But in analyzing the move by them pulling that trigger, those data might have said something about the tires and how they handled it. And if you look at the times of Vettel per lap when he came out compared to Hamilton, Vettel was a lot quicker. And it lasted for about 12, 13 laps. And eventually, both tires were equivalent to each other, with race usage and different temperatures, climbing in, climbing out of the temperature of the Celsius, depending of if it was sunny or not, or rain or not. So all those things combined, we would probably have done a situation for Ferrari. And on the short term, it seemed to be the right solution because Vettel was coming closer, but eventually they didn't deteriorate as expected, and Hamilton was fine. But that's what the gist of the situation and where to take that decision came from. And those data, the tire deterioration, only Ferrari knows those data about their own cars. So we cannot necessarily judge that fact, but it is intriguing in hindsight. But in that race situation, I would probably taken the same decision.
I think they probably would have. I can see the logic of bringing the cars in when they did, but from their point of view, that virtual safety car was deactivated probably about 30 seconds too soon. You could almost hear the groans coming from the Ferrari garage when Vettel rolled into the pits when those yellow lights went off. But comparing them to, say, Mercedes and Williams, who both went for a one-stop strategy, that seemed the way to go, because also Red Bull, they just didn't really have any pace once again, but definitely the Mercedes and Williams, that stop that they had, or the one-stop strategy that they had, that worked for them well. Their cars seemed to be going. They seemed to have plenty of grip. Unfortunately, Massa didn't make it the entire race, but Valtteri Bottas did. He got a P3 in the end, and I thought that he finally looked like the Bottas that we know from the last couple of years, and I think he'd be one of the winners from the race on Sunday. Obviously, another one would have been Lewis Hamilton, and I think Lewis Hamilton is probably saying 43 points. What's 43 points? Because that 43-point gap between him and Nico Rosberg has now eroded down to 9 points. 9. It's absolutely nothing now.
It's 9? We're talking about we have an open championship? Not just that. One of the two get momentum, and it ain't Nico. It's Lewis. And not only does he have momentum, he has the knowledge that, you know what, Nico? I always beat you in his season world championship. It's not the other way around. Who cares about your 7 in a row? I'm only 9 points back.
That's so true. And it's such an interesting fact that you should bring that up, because don't you always just get that feeling that whenever things are going well for Lewis Hamilton, that when he gets into a head-to-head situation with Nico Rosberg, don't you just get that feeling, that almost that confidence that from Lewis Hamilton just seems to permeate everything, that whatever he does, he's still going to come out, and he's going to come out on top of Nico Rosberg, who was pushing really hard at one point to really get back in and was looking that he may get close to getting to a podium. He was pushing Bottas, and then he gets the call from the pits. Nico, you have a slow puncture in your right rear tire. You're going to have to come in. You get the message, box, box, box. He pulls into the pits, and then that was going to be his almost redemption after that first corner, was to bring it all the way back, still get on the podium, and salvage a pretty good result, because at that point, obviously, there would be no point or little hope to catch the Ferrari in P2 unless Vettel had a problem, mechanical failure, and he stopped, and definitely he wouldn't be able to catch his teammate. But that just sort of summed up his afternoon. And then what further kind of went on to sum up his afternoon was a little bit later on. He was pushing Max Verstappen in the Red Bull later in the race. And I thought that was a great battle between the two of them, because you just knew that he would be lining him up that entire lap to go all the way around, get into that hairpin, get right on the gearbox of the Red Bull, go down that straight, activate the DRS, and make the overtaking maneuver into the chicane, come out in front, avoid the wall of champions, and there you go. You get that P4. But Max Verstappen, smart as he is, as young as he is, would pull over all the time right at the end there, just take away that inside of the track going into the chicane. Rosberg tried a couple of times, maybe look around the outside. It didn't work, and they tried it a couple laps from the end, and he couldn't make it stick and spun out slightly and then just hobbled around and managed to get back to the finish line. And what we heard after the race was a situation where he was almost not sure whether or not he'd be able to make the final lap of the race without running out of fuel, which was a real surprise. But he said, of course, he was using a lot of fuel with all the overtaking, with all the battling he was doing all afternoon. But that would have just been completely tragic for Nico Rosberg if he actually ran out of gas. And I think you have to make the point now that I think the last two races, Montreal and Monaco, have been kind of pretty much nightmares for Rosberg. He had that nice comfortable cushion, and now it's all but gone, and the season is wide open. It's game on, as they say.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, just to touch on the fuel aspect that you just mentioned, if you are a Sky Sports listener, you saw that little tidbit information being shared in the broadcast this weekend. How do you save fuel on an F1? How do you do that? You hear them all the time. How do you save fuel? How do you do that? Well, practically speaking, Mark, what it entails too is, instead of using the apex of the turn as where you're actually really getting into the turn and coming out perfectly and accelerating, you don't. You either don't brake as much and you coast your speed through it, so you don't use that throttle during that 4 or 5% of a lap, but of a turn, but overall the turns makes a difference. You coast. You don't brake at all, because if you brake, you have to start again. So you use a different technique. You drive almost a car more like a NASCAR than any F1. The way to explain that on a radio show, I know it's not easy, but a NASCAR, the apex of a NASCAR is very different. It's a way more further than it is in an F1, because you're trying to carry that speed so you don't have to restart that big hunk of steel further to go faster. Same principle can be applied in F1 to carry that speed through, which is even easier because the car just slides through air. They're a lot more aerodynamic. You carry that speed so you don't have the same amount of braking to do, because if you do a lot of braking, you need to restart. You know what I mean? So that's the start and stop costs a lot of gas. So that's how they save gas, by doing this and not overshifting, downshifting too much often to create that instability that you need to hit the throttle to make it stable. So that's how they save gas. But for Max Verstappen, the way defensively he drove with Nico Rosberg, what was impressive is the way he toyed with him. It's literally what Max Verstappen did to Nico. Okay, imagine a string between the two cars. Okay, if it's 1 second long, the difference between the two cars, you have enough clean air that you're able to get all the downforce needed to get into the DRS position, and then open the DRS, which is literally taking away the downforce out of your back wing, pass it over, put it back, and you're good to go. But if you're closer than a second, you're not in clean air anymore, you're in dirty air. And a car like Mercedes, which is built to be in front because that's where they have been for a long time, is not built to be in traffic. It's not built to have dirty air, so less dense air that it's not what the composition of air is, but it mixed with the exhaust and the wind turbulence, coming out of the downforce of the other car in front of you, which gives you less downforce and even less air density, which in theory gives you less downforce and less traction on the track. So all those factors combined, if you're too close, you actually need to take a step back before you can take your opportunity to overtake the driver in front of you. Go back to the situation.
So true. I beg your pardon.
No,
sorry. Go ahead.
No, just go back to the situation at hand of Verstappen and Rosberg. When he was coming closer, Verstappen knew that he had 2 laps to try to use that DRS, and he needs to recharge the battery. So he only has to hold for 2 laps. Once that opportunity is gone, you know that he needs to come back for a second or a second and a half to recharge the battery and to get downforce and traction and to get the tire to temperature. Because if you're losing downforce on your car, guess what happens nowadays? The tire don't get as hot. The tire don't get hot when it's cold outside. You don't have the traction. Same story we talked about earlier. So the whole aspect of how Verstappen literally toyed with Rosberg for a few laps is even more complex and complicated than just a guy who closed the door. That's how intelligent and how manageable is Max Verstappen with his car, because the radio, they're not allowed to tell him what to do. He needs to figure that out by himself at 18 and remember how to do it. It's mind-boggling to me. People don't understand how impressive this was. I think in years from now we'll remember this, but this is how impressive Max Verstappen was able to hold on a superior engine with a driver that's been proven and a winner behind him with a less good car. It's impressive.
Oh, definitely. And the thing was that you could tell at some point with all the tries that Rosberg was having that it was going to come down to something very similar. He was going to try and outbrake him going into that chicane. And I was thinking, well, you've already tried it a couple of times and it hasn't worked. You know, Max is... He's already figured out what you're going to do. So if you try and do the same thing again, he's going to try and do the same thing again. So obviously the third time that Nico tried it, he tried to outbrake him. But obviously Max being smart enough to take away that line into the chicane and making all those smart defensive moves.
It's like he knew. He knew Nico was going to try this that time, because it's like Max Verstappen was like, all right, I did this to you. I did this to you. Now you're going to try to react this way by overtaking me the other side. And, door's closed.
Well, not only that, but I think that he almost lured him into that mistake to a certain degree, because Nico tried to outbrake him, but guaranteed Verstappen braked as late as he possibly could while still being able to make it through the chicane and then back onto the start-finish straight without losing the control or going too deep into that corner and then having to go into the runoff or spinning out. It was very, very impressive.
How can you outbrake somebody that's going to outbrake you? You cannot outbrake somebody that brakes late because you're in the ditch. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it was almost a desperation move by Rosberg when you think about it, because he came so close to battling with Bottas and the Williams for that P3 and gets the basically was going to be the maximum points for him, and then just having that puncture and then losing a couple of spots and then just not being able to get around Verstappen. I think he really wanted to get as much as he possibly could, and it just didn't work out for him, and then he just basically hobbled around. But it was interesting just going back to what you were saying earlier just about the Mercedes being a car that's designed and built to be out front. And this was something very interesting, because I was wondering that myself, like earlier on in the year when we saw Nico Rosberg just basically disappearing into the distance in those 7 races, even going back to last year.
He's never
those
second,
races
right?
that he dominated. Different car, of course, but designed very similar. But now that we've seen him, and even Hamilton to a certain extent when he was having some problems, that when they get in the traffic, you're so right, that car just does not have the performance. And you should just think, oh yeah, well, he's in a Mercedes, he's driving a Red Bull or a Williams or whatever. He should just be able to come up and pass them and then just disappear. And it did happen a couple of times. Rosberg did get around Ricciardo fairly easily on that same long straightaway. But he did have a harder time, especially matched up with other cars with a Mercedes power unit in the back. The Williams, when he was behind Hülkenberg at the beginning of the race, he was stuck behind him for a number of laps before he was able to get around. So it is interesting that Mercedes isn't necessarily as good when it is stuck in traffic.
No, exactly. And it goes back to what Toto Wolff was saying as well, is the car itself was designed to be close to the front. And you mentioned Nico Rosberg. Have you noticed this year? He's never second or third going to first, at least not the last few races. He's either first, or he's fourth, fifth, sixth, and he's not necessarily looking like he's a world beater and he's able to climb back in the race. Well, it's a little bit by design because of the car. In traffic, it's not made to generate heat, traction, enough downforce with the speed, because it's fair and well and good to have a car that's really fast. But if you don't have the downforce accordingly, you're not going to be able to control that car around the track. So it's all a question of balance. And in traffic, that car is not balanced, literally. And that's the difference between what a Hamilton can do with an unbalanced car and what a Rosberg can do with the same car.
Well, exactly. Even going back to a couple of weeks ago on Monaco, when the car just wasn't behaving the way that Rosberg wanted it to. And he did not look like he was driving a dominant Mercedes that day. He just was not competitive right from the start of the race, and he steadily fell back and was even overtaken on the very last corner by Nico Hülkenberg, the aforementioned Nico Hülkenberg. Got him right at the very end on another unforgettable afternoon. And now in a couple of weeks, they're going to the European Grand Prix in Baku, Azerbaijan. It's a brand new track. Nobody knows what to expect. It's very much like at Sochi the other year, new track, and
it's
so we really won't
too.
know which cars are going to be suited to it. They're already saying that the Red Bulls are going to be much slower there.
Yeah,
they're not expecting that they're going to have as good of performance. And I think that was another guy that just talking about the Red Bull. Another guy that was a bit of a disappointment this weekend is poor Daniel Ricciardo, after coming so very, very close in Monaco in Spain to winning a Grand Prix. He was just basically there making up the numbers this past weekend, and Verstappen, obviously he was named the driver of the day, but Ricciardo sadly was another race for him just to forget.
To be fair, Verstappen just received an upgrade for the Renault engine before the Montreal race, the week, so that could explain the difference in the bump of performance compared to Monaco. But Ricciardo received the same upgrade before Monaco, but you cannot necessarily use that upgrade in Monaco because you don't necessarily use the engine that much. Just go back to Baku for a second, Mark. What interests me in the track is Sector 3 to the finish line. From turn 16 to 20, it's not a straight line, but it's not chicanes either. It's rolling, very slight turns. That is climbing uphill going into the old city. So you're going to pass next to the castle in this sector. So this sector is going to be very interesting because you can generate speed, and after turn 20 you're down to the home straightaway, the long one, then 290 degrees turn for the second longest straightaways. So for a car, let's just go talk to like a Mercedes, the way their engine is built, this circuit got two straightaways, one that is considered long if you include the rolling turn before it, because you can go almost 100% in that hole from 16 to the finish line. But in the sector 1, you have to be able to go to a lot of chicane from turn 1 to turn 5. And the beginning of this race really looks similar to Montreal. Not that it's the same, but the fact that there's two 90-degree turns close to each other, a little straightaways, then two other ones. So depending on how the start happens, it could be almost two starts because you have two 90-degree turns a little bit after two. So it's kind of a crazy beginning for a race, and that what intrigues me because nobody knows it. The amount of test session this week in Baku, everybody's going to put on the mileage in the training session because nobody knows this track. You're not necessarily able outside of simulators to get a good feel, and it's an urban circuit, so that means that you're not going to race there outside of this time of year. So you don't get a chance to really test it or have a pre-race on it, or like Circuit Villeneuve, other races you can come and drive on it. It's not the case there. So that's fascinating to me, and it's a new race. It's brand new for everybody, and it kind of levels the playing field, and it kind of gives the team with more wits, more experience, aka Williams, Ferrari, maybe not an edge, but enough to bridge that gap with Mercedes.
Well, it could very much be like another Monaco, because Monaco, especially if you get a little bit of rain or things change a little bit, it's a complete roll of the dice and anything can happen. But as you were talking there, I was just looking at the circuit layout myself, and I just love the stats here. It says here, the Baku City Circuit, first Grand Prix 2016, number of laps to be confirmed, circuit length to be confirmed, race distance to be confirmed, and lap record not applicable. But it is very cool. Definitely, it's an interesting layout, and definitely being a city circuit makes things so much different, especially when you get into the middle of the track between sector 1 and sector 2. You have it looks like about 120-degree turn at turn 7, and then 3 or 4 rapid turns at starting at turn 8 to turn 12, these little chicanes and things that all look to be only compacted into about a couple of 100 meters, and then going around the back of the circuit through a couple more not quite so drastic corners, but another 90-degree corner, turn 15 and 16, and then winding its way back to the start finish. So it should be a very, very interesting race to see, and it could be a big leveler, and we won't really know who's going to be up for it, like you say, because it's brand new for everybody.
Here's a little quirky fact about some of the part of the track in Baku, Mark. Some of the track are actually using old cobbled roads that dates hundreds, if not thousands of years. And to make sure that F1 can drive on it, they created a false road over it with like a cushion of air between it, and then they paved that with brand new spanking new pavement just for this part of the race. So that's interesting that it's literally built on castles and the old and the new Baku, and that's kind of let's face it, this Grand Prix exists to promote Baku as a tourism destination. Nobody hides itself. That's why the European Games were there last year. That's why they call the Baku Grand Prix the European Grand Prix, because they want people to associate in their mind Baku with Europe and not Baku with the Orient. So that's why they're trying to really say, look, Baku, Europe. Baku European game last year. They hosted it, the biggest European game in history. And this year, you have the European Grand Prix in Baku because, well, Baku and Azerbaijan want to promote their tourism industry and want to show what they can do, and they want to show the best of what Baku has to offer. That's the old castles and that's the new architecture. And they want to find a way to bridge all that together. And that explains a bit of the actual circuit itself, because it's made to go around historic buildings, to go around the castle next to it. I think actually in it too, if I'm not mistaken. So that might be another interesting thing to look at.
Well, I'm really looking forward to watching them run around there, and I'm fairly impressed with the new circuits that they've used over the last several years. I think that Sochi is an interesting one too, because it is somewhat sandwiched in between all the different facilities that they built for the 2014 Winter Olympics that were there, and this is very much the same thing. Instead of having the arena for the speed skating and then for the hockey and all these different sport facilities, you're driving around through all these ancient buildings and the castles, like you say. So it is going to be a very, very interesting race, and it should be quite something to watch these cars going around those different parts of the city. And it's also going to be interesting also from a crowd point of view, because being in the middle of the city there aren't really a lot of spaces to put a lot of these big grandstands. So I think there's only going to be something like 20 or 25,000 seats available for the fans.
Very similar
so I guess
to
for
Monaco.
the people that are going to be there, it's going to be a bit more of an intimate atmosphere compared to, say, where you have like a well-attended Grand Prix like Montreal this past weekend, for example, or the British Grand Prix where you have like 100,000 or 150,000 people on race day. So this is almost the kind of crowd you'd see at a hockey game or a basketball game, like 20,000 people. So that will be interesting as well.
Yeah, but the big difference is, though, the impact on this city. Can you imagine if you have a F1 Grand Prix in the streets of Vancouver? You don't care if only 25,000 people showed up. It's going to be the talk of the town for months to come. Because
the economic spin-off.
Not just the economics. That's the corner that every day you're going to walk to work and you're going to pass the spot where Alonso won finally his race for McLaren after 5 years of drought. I don't know. I'm just going here with ideas, but you know what I mean? Part of the city become iconic with the race. Walking in the exhibition in Toronto, having seen the Molson Indy once in my life, when I walked down, like, hey, that's where I saw Patrick Carpentier overtake Tagliani once, you know? you get that vibe, and you can only have that in an urban circuit. So that's the interesting part. Just to compare with Sochi again, Sochi though, it's almost more of a real circuit itself. It's more wide. It's built in a way that you actually take advantage of the car, and it's built to show off what an F1 can do. Baku's not the same. Baku's built as a challenge. So that's what's the interesting part. It's closer to a Monaco than it is to a Montreal, but it's still a unique circuit and one that you cannot necessarily compare to a Valencia or other typical Fiorano or a Monza typical track that you would see an F1 on.
Yeah, and that's what I think is interesting about Sochi as well, is that it's a purpose-built Formula One track in the middle of a city, but it's not a street circuit because you don't see the cars driving around there day-to-day traffic like you would see in Monaco once they take the barriers down and take all the tire barriers and things away and then close the pits down. And Baku is, it's going to be a real challenge. And I encourage people that are listening to go and take a look at the track layout, because when you see those series of chicanes and twists in there, it's going to be something. And it'll be interesting to see once you see the entire field of those Formula One cars going through there, especially where the places that are they going to be able to or overtake? Are they going to be in these 90-degree corners or some of these tight little chicanes, or is it maybe on that long straightaway at going into the start finish, or is it going to be one of these tracks where it's very difficult to pass, like Monaco? Because in Monaco there's only a couple places that people tend to pass, and that's going into the first corner was at Saint-Avold, I believe it is, and then also at the end of the tunnel into the chicane there, and that's always been a couple of places, unless you're the two Saubers or Danny Kvyat, and that's where you kind of crash into each other at the Rascasse and incur the wrath of your team owner and the team brass, which was interesting too, angry. Because the two Saubers, I think, must have been on their best behavior not to crash into each other after being equally blamed for the coming together in Monaco 2 weeks ago.
Beat would not have been happy if that would have happened again. Trust me. I heard him talk about it last week. And he was still mad about Monaco. So can you imagine if they would have taken each other out this weekend?
Well, that definitely would have been bad news, especially, well, I don't know, can you even really fire a driver that is basically paying for a Formula One seat when you're like a Felipe Nasr or a Marcus Harrison that brings millions of dollars in sponsorship money? It's like you can't really fire them, and their sponsorship money, and that all disappears with them, of course.
Team almost folded like 5 Grand Prix ago. So you know what? Maybe they would have said, you know what? Maybe we should have folded. You guys get out of here. You're fired. We're shutting down shop. That probably could happen if they take each other out again.
It probably could. So maybe that's why they were on their best behavior this past weekend. But while we're still talking here, you had some news on Michael Schumacher, did you not?
Well, just for some reason today, I thought, it's been a while we haven't heard some Schumacher, because there is a blackout. Media, it's not that it's a blackout, but the Schumacher family don't want to sell their progress of Michael, if there's any to be broadcasted, and people to follow this on a daily situation. So there's no news. So what you hear is hearsay. But an article on a website called Parent Herald came out today, this actually last night, and it talked about a couple of different things they heard about Schumacher. Apparently, he has built a medical facility, literally in his home, where he has been trying to rehabilitate. There's no news of his progress per se, but what we know is been taken care of by what they say is maybe a team of 15 medical experts daily, and the cost of his medical expenses are going through the roof. We're talking about $140,000 medical expenses a week. They have sold, his wife is in the process of selling their private jet, and they sold their Norwegian home earlier this year. But it was estimated that his fortune was around $800 million before his ski accident that happened, 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, it's about that, yeah.
So ever since then, it did cost about $15 million a year average for medical expenses so far. And the progress that has been shown, the only thing that people say, like Luca Di Montezemolo, who said last May 27th, actually when there was a gala, and the former manager of Sarah Michel, the former manager of Michael Schumacher, received like a legendary award in his behalf, and De Montezemolo was present in the room. And when he was asked about Michael, he talked about how, well, it's hard to say, we're not going to talk about his progress, but he is reacting well to treatment. What does that say? I don't know. Does it say a lot? I don't necessarily know. I actually think that it doesn't say a lot at all. I think he still has some motor issues because he was not able to respond physically. He was not able to respond verbally. But it doesn't necessarily bode well for the future. You shouldn't necessarily expect things to be better for the future. But he does have probably the best situation ever, because he has a lot of money and private medical experts that can help him. But it's a tough battle, and there's not a lot of progress. What has been said is that he's reacting to treatment. So at least we know now, because we were in the dark for months, that he is having treatment and he is reacting. And it's maybe more than just him in a non-responsive state. He is at least in a responsive state. Whatever does that entails, I don't know. But at least we know that he's reacting to treatments and he is in a responsive state.
That's definitely a mixed message, and hopefully one of these days we'll get to some better news or some more news onto his actual progress and his current state of health. But like you say, when you don't really hear too much, it leaves a lot to speculation. When you speculation, you tend to think more of the worst rather than maybe a better, a more complete recovery. But talking about Luca de Montezemolo, he was talking the other day that about Bernie Ecclestone. Of course, Bernie's the commercial rights holder. Bernie's getting up there a little bit. He's 85. He's had a controlling interest in Formula One since the 1970s. And De Montezemolo said that sooner or later, if F1 has to think about how to replace Bernie, Bernie is a fantastic person. I think it'll be impossible and a mistake to find one man to replace him. It's important to think of new governance. And basically, I think he said that it'll take at least 3 people to do the work of one Bernie Ecclestone, which is true. I think that the man is a machine. I mean, he has been the driving force behind Formula One for decades.
Conspiracy Kevin is coming back to F1 podcast. You remember a few months ago, we talked about it, Mark. There was a meeting between Toto Wolff, Marchionni of Ferrari, and other names of the F1 world that were not divulged. And it was asked at Bernie in the beginning of this. I think it was actually in China, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, it was in China, I remember correctly, because of the dome on top of the track. That's where Bernie was when he was asked. Bernie, there was like a meeting earlier today or yesterday with like Toto and Marchionni of Ferrari, and what do you think they're doing? Trying to replace me, he said. Half joking, but if you know Bernie, you probably know that, you know what, he was 100% serious.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's what it is. And if you think about a meeting or a committee to replace a man like Ecclestone, who would you think of? Toto Wolff, Marchionni, maybe a Jean Todt, or, you know, those are the guys that were probably in the room. So put 2 and 2 together, maybe it's going to happen sooner than we think.
Well, that is a very good point. And De Montezemolo even went on to say that you need a small group of people who are basically very strong in the area that they're of their expertise. Somebody knows Formula One and what their market needs, what the fans need, and things like that. Because it is really interesting when you look at how different the fans are in each country. They come here to Canada. They go to Montreal, which is a highlight for the fans and the drivers and the teams, not only for the race and the track, but the great city of Montreal and then the nightlife and all the things to do there. And the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve is always packed on race day. There's always plenty of fans. You go to Silverstone, it's the same way. Australia always seems to be fairly well attended as well. And then you go to some other races, like the other year, last year, they didn't even have a German Grand Prix, which is a mind blower when you consider that the top team is German. There are several drivers. The top drivers are
Best
German.
Cars
Nico Rosberg.
in the world are Germans. Not even there. Like a year of F1, no Hockenheim or Nürburgring. Come on, you have to choose one of the two, and if you don't, it's just not F1 to me. It's not a world championship if there's no race in Germany. Come on.
Well, exactly. And I've been to one Grand Prix. Well, I've been to several Grand Prix, but the first one I went to was the 2001 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. And it was absolutely amazing. We sat at the hairpin at the bottom of the track where we'd see the cars coming down the hill at full speed, break into the hairpin, go around, and then go up the hill and then into a quick left-hander. And it was a great weekend. We were staying not so far away. It was a bit of a drive, but just the whole atmosphere around it. And of course, that was the early 2000s. That was the heyday of Ferrari and Michael Schumacher, where you could sit there and there would be 150,000 Germans all dressed in red with the Ferrari flags. And it was amazing. And just to see how you have Sebastian Vettel at Ferrari, you have Nico Rosberg at Mercedes. Granted, Nico's not a world champion, but Sebastian won 5 world championships with Red Bull. And just to think that even the year before when they raced at Hockenheim, the stands were half empty. It's just a situation that I can't really get my mind about. But there were some other comments that I remember reading in this past fall or winter. I think it was after last season, so it must have been around Christmas time that. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase here, but they were talking to Bernie Ecclestone about maybe making Formula One more accessible, maybe more appealing to the younger generation, and he basically said he wasn't so much interested in appealing to like the millennials and the younger crowd. He said, I'm more interested in getting the 70-year-old guy that has a lot of money. I'm like, okay, well, that's fair, but that
think about
17-year-old guy is not going to be around for a long time.
Exactly.
But think about the 20-year-old guy that's on his tablet or on his smartphone all the time, that's really savvy with social media. That's a huge segment of the global population you're just discounting and not even considering, really.
Mark, you're going to get me started on a societal debate here. Talking about old people who don't understand the young generation. Come on. Mm-hmm. Bernie Ecclestone doesn't understand math, because if you're old, 70 years old, rich guy, put in best case scenario, gives you his money for 10 years as a fan. All right? Yep. You'll make X amount of money. But if you hook the guy that's like 10 years old, he doesn't give you money now, but as soon as he got money, he's going to give it to you. When he's 16, 17 and gets his first car, he's going to drive to Montreal and go to his first Montreal Grand Prix. And fork a lot of money there. And the more disposable income he does have in his life, the more he's going to spend it to you. And when he's become 7 years old and he's rich, then he would have been giving you his money for 60 years continuing. So you know what? Mathematically, you should always try to include the younger generation. It's just good for business. It's sad to say, but it's true. And otherwise, too, it's fun when you're a kid to watch F1. So you got everybody. Everybody's happy.
Well, that's true. And I believe that at Silverstone last year for the British Grand Prix that they restructured their ticket pricing. They made it more family friendly. And
even in Montreal, to be quite honest, $46 a day was the price for a general admission ticket in the Montreal Grand Prix section. It wasn't sold out, the Grand Prix this weekend. There was still tickets to be sold, and I think it's important to note no records were broken this week. I remember when I was younger, records were broken every week with the Montreal Grand Prix. 150,000, no. It's scaled back. But you know what it felt like, Mark? It felt more like a Grand Prix of the people. Like more for the actual people. The people I saw in the stands of the Montreal Grand Prix aren't the people I saw when I walked down the streets of my city. And that tells a lot about, does a city embrace an event? Yes, and that's how you see it, and it's very important to me that the Grand Prix stays. Every time Bernie Ecclestone comes here, he mentions, we shouldn't come back. They haven't done their promises. We're supposed to renovate the entire, well, not the entire, but renovate the paddock area and make it bigger, wider. Yes, the need is there, yes, but there's a big pool that's there for rowing. That's not necessarily easy to just move away, Bernie. You need to architecturally speaking, find a way to build on top of that pool. It's not necessarily easy to do, and it's cost-worthy on all that. Contractually speaking, Montreal has until 2017 to renovate part of the paddock and the installation for the Montreal Grand Prix. For the contract up until 2024 is still valid. It is a contract breaker type of deal that if it's not done until next year's Grand Prix, might be a problem. So that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. But please, Bernie, stop trying to milk every city possible and everybody for money. And sometimes you need to think about the benefit of having a little bit more open type of sport.
It's interesting that you should say that, because on Formula1.com, on their own website, that on their winners and losers article that they always come out with post Grand Prix, that one of their winners for the Montreal Grand Prix was the city of Montreal itself, where they say that the city thrives on the Grand Prix, which attracts vast numbers of visitors each year who also naturally venture downtown to spend their money. Yes, some newer venues may have superior pit and paddock facilities than the Ile Notre-Dame Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, but when it comes to showing the world how to make a city race work, Montreal wins hands down. So maybe that one kind of slipped through Bernie's personal stamp of approval, but
they still mentioned that upgrade were
yes.
So they did put the editorial note in there somewhere.
Yeah, there was a bit of a poke there, but it's interesting that you were mentioning about that.
Go ahead. Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just hey, here's a tap in the back, a little clap in the face, but we're giving you a tap in the back at the same time.
Exactly. But just talking about Grand Prix that have had their contract extended, the Brazilian Grand Prix at Interlagos has been extended to 2020, when there was there's some speculation that they might not be on this calendar for next year. And of course, Bernie has said that about several races, also including Monza. You were saying just now that you couldn't picture a Formula One calendar without a German Grand Prix at a Hockenheim or a Nürburgring. Likewise, I cannot picture a Formula One without Monza, one of the tracks that they've been at right from the very beginning, although it's evolved over the years. Then, Monza is another one that I cannot picture. And then, of course, those rumors that they're still going to get a race in Vegas. Sounds like it's a good time to be Las Vegas. It sounds like the National Hockey League is going there. Formula One is going there.
Hi,
Everything's
Quebec.
Coming up Vegas.
Sorry, I had to do it. Hi, Quebec City. No, not this time.
Not this time. Poor Quebec City. They're not getting their Nordiques back anytime soon.
I still go with my idea, Mark. Can you imagine, okay, if we have a Formula One championship, okay, in a 21 season race, there's enough space for put 15 of the Grand Prix that you want, the Russia, Sochi, those money-making Grand Prix, okay? But leave 6 for iconic tracks around the world. You include in Nürburgring, even though it doesn't exist still. I don't know. Change and some parts are closed, I know. But imagine a world that it's possible. You have a Le Mans race in F1. Can you imagine a race in Le Mans with F1? A Daytona race, an oval on F1. Just one track. But you need to include the spirit of motor racing back in F1, because it is motorsport, and even though it worked really hard over the years to get away from being a motorsport by saying we're better, we're best, we're not related, you are. And you're top of that pyramid, you're in a motorsport, and why not shine a light on the history? I know Bernie Ecclestone doesn't care about history, but history should be the base of any sport, because it just hypes up your product. If you tell your fans that your product back then is not important, it kind of says that your product now is not important by the backside. So you need to hype your history. You need to talk about it. And the F1 history is so rich, and you do have those monuments still present. So can you imagine a race in Le Mans, a race in Monaco, but have more like those? Not all of them, but just a few to make that championship, that world championship, truly an achievement. Like, can you imagine if you have to run on an oval in F1? There's ways to do it. I know it's probably not going to be on Daytona because of the banks, you know what I mean? But the idea is there. Just take another iconic track like Laguna Seca and have that work, and that could work probably even better. But Road America, example. I'm saying a lot of American track, but it's just to give an option. When F1 talks about going to the U.S., it's always Austin. Yeah, they built a brand new track for us. It looks sparkling new. There's Star Spangled Banner everywhere. It's American. We love it. Let's go there. But go to the history of the sport in the States. Maybe you'll find that soul that people say it's missing in the sport.
Yeah, I think that Formula One that works it builds on that history, that soul, like you say, and then the spectacle, and then they bring the new to it, and then also the technology. It's a blending of all these different aspects of it, and I think that's what makes Formula One unique, and that's why I think to remove some of these iconic circuits, that if we wouldn't have a Spa-Francorchamps or a Monza or a Hockenheim, well, I mean, the new Hockenheim and the old Hockenheim are two completely different things, but just some of these iconic tracks, to take them away, it's just like, when was the last time we had a French Grand Prix? Was it 2004? It's been a dozen years at least, or at least a decade since they've had a race in France, which is another bit of a mind bender, which is France was basically where it all started way back when. And
Renault, Peugeot, Citroën, Opel.
Well, yeah, exactly. All these iconic car marks as well that have come from France, and all these legendary racers as well. Alain Prost, for example, is one that comes to mind.
Ligier, and the team Ligier, a lot of things in France and F1 is linked together, and it still is to this day with Renault. But Circuit Paul Ricard, when they changed it and made it a test track, I thought it happened a long time ago, I think a decade ago. But I was like, yeah, it's kind of cool. They could develop more, but you're losing the competitive side of this track, and that's just sad.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Kevin, what do you think? Do we have anything else tonight?
I think we probably
we've kind of been waxing here and kind of going on about things. We are, of course, available to consult. Should anybody been listening, you can email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. We're more than happy to weigh in and try and make the sport better. But joking aside, what else do we have tonight?
Oh, I think that wraps it up, Mark. I think we really talked a lot about F1, and just two things to remember of the Montreal Grand Prix, Canadian Grand Prix, to move forward, because, hey, we have another race to talk about this weekend. Baku comes back really shortly, and quite a track from Montreal to Baku for everybody involved, by the way, but in a short period of time. But Montreal Grand Prix, two things. Vettel's performance, how he was able to push that Ferrari and get almost a win if it wasn't for a strategy error, and the way Verstappen held off Nico, which is, for me, a career-defining moment that people in the know will look at before they sign him for a long-term contract. Might be Red Bull, might be other teams. We'll see, because he might be demanding a lot of money now because of those type of performances. Because for a race director, what we saw there, a guy that can save fuel and be faster than a potential world champion, hey, that's worth a lot of money.
And Red Bull definitely looked like they got that call right by demoting Danny Kvyat back to Toro Rosso and promoting Verstappen up to the big team, to the A team, to Red Bull proper. And that definitely has worked out for them. It obviously worked out for them right away with him winning in Spain, which is still a complete mind bender to get your head around. But definitely Max Verstappen is one of those special drivers that only comes along once in a generation, maybe even longer. So it's an exciting time to watch him and just see where he goes, not only in his career, but also from week to week. It almost comes down to it when they line up, when those lights go out and they go green, it just kind of goes into your head, what are we going to see from Max today? Because he's an exciting driver to watch, and something always happens when Max Verstappen is on the track.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, Kevin, well, let's wrap things up here. So why don't you let everybody know where they can find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Kev Laramie, and find Scuderia F1 Podcast and all the shows we produce here on the sportspodcastnetwork.com.
Very good. And of course, if you want to get in touch with us here at the show, you can email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. And we also have a Twitter, and that is also fairly straightforward, at Scuderia F1 Pod. And that is it. That's a wrap. I'm Mark Daly, and on behalf of my co-host Kevin Laramie, we'll be back only in a couple of days to talk about the inaugural European Grand Prix at Baku in Azerbaijan. Until then, we'll see you again.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to scuderiaf1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us sportspodcastingnetwork.com.